Hello, how are you doing? We are getting the weirdest weather here in London. For a couple weeks back, it was really quite warm, and suddenly it's become very chilly again, and so much so that it's even snowing here in London this morning. So I'll show you a picture of the outside of what I'm looking at in my garden. Even though it's quite sunny, there's a bit of snow coming down, which is a lovely thing. So I'm back here in my little garden shed, or the garden studio, as I like to call it, with a cozy jumper and a mug of cinnamon tea to talk about what I read over the past month. And I have been quite busy over the past month, as I keep mentioning. I've been really busy with work and doing this writing project of these two books that I've been commissioned to write, and I finally finished them. I'm sorry if I keep complaining about them, but it's really alongside my full-time job, it's really quite a lot on my table. So yeah, I'm just so thrilled to finally be finished with this work. Though it's been really interesting and exciting to write these books, and a really good challenge, but it's just been quite a lot. So, but I have managed to do a lot of reading as well, and read a number of books, some of them slightly connected with this writing project that I've been working on, and which I'll talk about later this year when these books should be coming out at the end of October. So that'll be really exciting. But yeah, I read 8 books, and yeah, I'm going to go through and discuss them now. And it seems only appropriate, since it's snowing a little bit out, to talk about this first book, which is The Snowball by Brigid Brophy, which is a novel which was reprinted a couple of years ago. It was first published in the 60s, I believe, and Brigid Brophy is an author that I've sort of always heard about in the past, but never actually read before. Yeah, it was first published in 1964. And I've always meant to read her, because she sounds like a really fascinating figure from literary history, because she was a lover of Iris Murdoch's at one point, and yeah, and she wrote a number of books, and this novel, The Snowball, is just such a gorgeous, beautiful story about a New Year's Eve ball at this lavish mansion, and there's a masquerade ball that's held, and this woman who's called Anna dresses up as a figure from a Mozart opera to go to this ball, and there she meets on the dance floor Don Giovanni, the man that in the opera has a romance with her, and so in the way that life imitates art, in this kind of artifice of this masquerade ball, they have this whirlwind romance over the course of this New Year's Eve night, and we follow their story, as well as the story of 2 other couples, of the couple that actually own this mansion, and another couple that are just sort of watching on and are quite voyeuristic, watching everyone in the room, and the couplings that take place. And yeah, there's this whole it's quite a romantic sense around this, centered around this ball, but there's also this playing with identity of, you can sort of be whoever you want to be at this masquerade ball, and you get these little snippets about how there's her life behind, the mask of that she's wearing that evening, that she's a middle-aged woman, she's divorced, and so doesn't feel as attractive as, kind of a young woman that's just sort of starting out, and during this ball she's able to have this whirlwind romance, and yeah, there's this wonderful push and pull to the couples in this story, and this wonderful sense of description, of quite odd descriptions that she gives of the ball, and the details of the social interactions of everyone there. And yeah, I just really enjoyed this story. I also just finished reading Paradais by Fernanda Melchor, which I've been so looking forward to, because I enjoyed isn't quite the right word. I hugely appreciated her previous novel, Hurricane Season, so much. So I was very excited about this, and it's been longlisted for the International Booker Prize, and her writing is incredibly powerful. It's set in Mexico, and it's a much more shorter and concentrated novel than that previous book, but handles a lot of the same subject matter and uses quite a similar style. Her writing has this real breathless quality to it, in that it's almost like this kind of stream of consciousness as you're following the characters throughout their experience in this very fast-paced and heady way. You're just like bombarded, your senses are bombarded by everything around these characters, but it's very much through their perspectives. And so you're following the perspective mainly of one character in this, who's a young man that works as groundskeeper on this upscale estate in Mexico, a private estate, and he is in this position where he's really stuck. He doesn't earn much money. And all the money that he does earn directly goes to his mother that he lives with, who's very overbearing and controls him, and he just spends all this time outside of working with this boy, this kind of teenager or young man, who is the son of a family that lives on the estate, and who's very spoiled and overweight, and he speaks very disparagingly about his weight all the time, and how this boy like spends all his time watching porn and fantasizing about his female neighbor, and he's really obsessed with his female neighbor and wants to have sex with her, and so he devises a plot to both have sex with her and rob her family, and pulls this groundskeeper into his plot. And so they're not even really friends. They have quite an antagonistic relationship, or at least the main character, he really looks down on this teenage boy, and but he the sense she gives of how both these young men are really like stuck in their lives and don't really have too many prospects, even though the young man comes from this privileged family. The other young man comes from this very privileged family. He's kind of wasting his life away, and how they're really stuck in their positions, but also stuck in this very misogynistic point of view, like the way that they see the world, and particularly women around them. They just sort of refer to them as sluts who want to have sex with them, and so it's a bit hard to tell, like is this really how the world is around them, or is it just because they see it through this very misogynistic point of view? So that the way she evokes this world is so powerful and really strong and vivid, though there's a lot of violence and hatred in it, but the way that she embeds you in the perspective of these characters, I think brings it to life in such a moving and meaningful way that I could almost like feel slightly like sympathetic for them, because they're so trapped in this point of view and in their circumstances, but at the same time the things they do are so horrible, and the attitudes that they have are so horrible, that it gives you this real conflicted sense, or at least it did for me reading this, and I found it so powerful and strong in the way that it discusses these larger issues, like through the very narrow perspective of these characters, because that is their worldview. That's all they know, and it's really moving how she does that, and it's this gradual build up to this horrible, violent episode, which is coming, and which comes only in the last maybe 10 or 15 pages of the book, and the way she reports that as well, the details of that event, I think is so powerful. I keep saying powerful, but I think she's an incredible writer, and this is a great book. I've heard some people say that Hurricane Season is slightly better than this, but I think this is equally as powerful. I also read the reprint of this novel They by Kay Dick, which was first published in 1977 and was reprinted recently, and there's a whole mythology around this, that a literary agent, I think it was a literary agent, was in a charity shop, and they stumbled across this old copy of this novel, this very short novel, and which had fallen out of print a long time ago, and so rediscovered it, and it was reprinted by Faber Books, and they sort of describe it as this lost dystopian classic, and there's a whole string of authors that have given their endorsements of this book. But I think describing it as a dystopian book is slightly misselling it, because actually the content of the story, like when it was originally published, it was described as kind of a fever dream, and I think that's a much more apt description of the novel, because it's a series of vignettes, or maybe like short stories that are kind of connected with each other, even though you're not entirely sure if there's characters that connect or overlap between the stories, but yeah, it's set in this world where there's a group of artists basically that live on the fringes of society outside the mainstream, and how their individuality and creativity are suppressed by this larger majority, and this section of the population that's just referred to as they, that are sort of hovering in the background, which come in to steal their books, destroy their artworks, or actually physically harm them to stop them expressing themselves creatively, and so yeah, it is this very like creepy sense of this, though it's not described whether there's like an organized authoritarian regime in the background, in the way of some dystopians, but yeah, it's not dystopian so much as just like very uneasy, and you feel like there are these individuals which aren't being as appreciated by the majority, and who are looked down and frowned upon because yeah, they're not subscribing to the things that larger society likes, including watching television or listening to pop music, and those aspects of culture are spoken about in a really disparaging way. And so over time, as I was reading this, it felt not so much as like a statement against a larger society as an individual that the author is kind of like whinging about the things in society that she sees as objectionable, and this sort of sense of not being as appreciated as she wants to be, and I don't know if that's like fair or not to do as a reading, but I just really got this sense, this, especially like this, like in the attitudes towards children in this book, like all the children in this book are kind of like little monsters that are torturing animals and running around in this almost feral way in these groups, in these like mobs of children, and which I can sort of sympathize with in slightly, in that I can find lots of children like quite annoying as well, but almost like for that reason made me almost feel like, well, this is more just like the author's own like paranoid points of view or sense of being very reserved, and so it's interesting because I wanted to learn more about this author, and so looked up and found the first thing that came up in the search engine was an obituary that was written about her in The Guardian in, I think, 2001 she died, and which was the most disparaging obituary I think I've ever read. I'll put a link to it below because it made me so fascinated about it. Just spoke about her as this woman that was like very difficult, and like used her friends and borrowed a lot of money all of the time, and and was quite like catty amongst the literary community, and so eventually became something of an outcast, even though she's had this tremendous like literary career, like working as an editor who worked with George Orwell and a number of writers, and was lovers with some other prominent female writers of the time. So I feel like between this and Brigid Brophy, I'm sort of exploring the like hidden history of like literary lesbian culture in Britain in the past like 50 years. But it's an interesting book, but I wouldn't say it's the big huge classic that lost classic that the publishers are making out of. I think that's more kind of marketing speak and spiel. But there are interesting things about it. But yeah, I just became more interested in the actual author's life than in the book itself. Have you ever found that that's happened to you before? I also read the collection Happy Stories Mostly by Indonesian author Norman Erikson Pasaribu, which is a collection that is, I found it to be almost like of two halves, that there were some stories which were very conceptual, and then there were other stories which were very emotional and much more about the characters that he was writing about. And a lot of the latter stories I found, I wish they'd been like developed into a whole novel. Like there's a novel, there's this a short story about a nun that sort of sneaks out to enjoy malls and to visit boys that she knew from the past when she was a teacher. And there's another short story about a mother that whose son is gay and who has a husband that he's been with for a long time, and she's pressured her son into to conceiving a child, to use a surrogate to conceive a child, and she sort of snoops around their rooms to find about what's going on in their relationship and going on in their life. And yeah, I really enjoyed that story. And then there were other stories which, like the opening and closing story, which are sort of about the writing process itself. Like the opening story is set in a creative writing class, and then the final story is about a woman that is very much aware that she's a character being written about, and every time she tries to transcend the boundaries of her world, she just encounters blank space or like blank pages, or because yeah, that's an area that hasn't been written about by the author. And yeah, there are other stories like that that are yeah, much more conceptual. There's a story about someone that's just been inducted into heaven, into this very bureaucratic job in heaven, and so all about the rules of following that. And yeah, I found those quite creative and fun, but just didn't have the same emotional pull as some of these other stories. And so yeah, I enjoyed this collection, and particularly the way that he brings in a lot of the life of gay or queer characters, like often quite almost like at an arm's distance, as I described how often from the perspective of a mother or a sister, rather than actually portraying the voices of these gay characters, which is an interesting point of view, and I think interesting way to approach it. So yeah, I really enjoyed this collection, but yeah, I think a lot of these stories will probably like drift away, whereas if some of them had been developed into a full novel, they would sort of stay with me more. And I think probably there was a lot of references in it, because it's a culture that I don't know all that much about, that I probably didn't completely get all the references that were being made. There's an interesting interview between the author and translator at the end of the book where they discuss some of these, which yeah, I found really interesting to read about and learn more about, because as I always say, it's it's not the author's fault that I don't know these references. It's because yeah, I don't I'm just don't happen to be familiar with it, and so it'll be like interesting to read more about this culture and these issues than having finished these stories. I also read Irish author Audrey Magee's new novel The Colony, because I loved her debut novel The Undertaking, and this is a very different setting for a story, but still deals with conflict, individuals caught up in larger political and social conflicts, so particularly looking at the Troubles in Ireland and the fallout from that through the perspective of one small rocky island off the coast of Ireland, where the people there, it has a sort of dwindling population, and many of the people there still speak native Irish Gaelic, and but that's of an older generation, and the younger generation is much more bilingual, particularly one boy in this, the youngest boy that still lives on the island. He increasingly speaks English. He prefers to be referred to by his English name rather than his Irish name, and it's I think he's really the heart of the story, though it's the story, the frame of it is more about two outsiders that come to this island. One is an Englishman who's a painter who comes to the island because he wants to paint the scenes of the island and the people on the island to restore his art career back in London, and he wants to prove to his wife that he has a kind of strained relationship with that he's this great artist. He wants to be known as the Gauguin of the North, and the novel opens with a very funny scene of him coming to the island, and he wants to approach the island in an old-fashioned way by using a boat, which is like outmoded and not really used anymore. But he pays a lot of money to have locals row him to this island on this boat, which is very rocky, and he gets seasick a number of times along this journey, but he wants to have, the authentic experience of approaching the island. And it's just like very funny, the description of him getting so seasick and getting really frustrated and angry on this boat ride, but because he wants to have this authentic experience. But then also on the island is a Frenchman who has been visiting the island over a number of years, and he's a linguist, and he wants to capture how the language on the island is changing, because he sees it as this outpost of where they still speak Gaelic, and the purity of their language is being lost by the English influence. And so he gets very upset that this Englishman has also traveled to the island, and he sees him, because he only speaks English, this Englishman only speaks English, as sort of perverting the language of the island. And so they sort of buck heads with each other and while on this island, and are themselves kind of colonizers of this island in this way, because the locals just sort of tolerate them because they spend a lot of money there, and the native industry of the island, which is fishing, has been dwindling out. And so, they need this sort of cash injection in the island by these visitors, but they just kind of tolerate them and kind of speak about them behind their backs. And so you get this larger sense of what colonization means, and the impact over time, and especially for the natives on the island, and how the boy on the island, quite understandably, he doesn't want to be a fisherman. He wants to go to England. He wants to be a painter and wants to speak English. But at the same time, there's this mournful sense that there's this whole culture, native culture, that's being lost. And so she discusses these issues through the characters, I think, in a very artful way, and also interjects between the story of their interactions on this island scenes that are told in almost a journalistic way of conflicts during the Troubles of individuals, a lot of them just sort of ordinary individuals that get caught up in the Troubles and are either wounded or die as a consequence of the Troubles. And they're just these short accounts that are interspersed throughout it, where you see what happens to these individuals, and it's quite powerful how she does that, to just show how all of these individuals and communities get wrapped up in these larger social and political conflicts. And I found that really powerful, and I think it's a really beautifully done novel, and that has quite a tragic ending, and I found it very moving at the end, the eventual consequences of these people that come to the island, and where it leaves the boy that is native to the island. I found very moving. Another novel very much about like political and social conflict and individuals that get caught up in it, which I already talked about briefly in a previous video, of 5 Days Untold by Badr Ahmad, which is set in Yemen and during a time of civil war, and a boy from the local community, a teenage boy, that gets conscripted into fighting in this war, even though he really doesn't want to, and it's not his nature. And so you see his point of view as he goes into war, over the course of 5 days, and gets caught up in this conflict in this very horrific way. And as I said previously, like his sections I think are so powerfully done, but then there are other sections which describe his family and the consequences of what happens to his family. His father is kind of disabled and in a very bad state, and his mother and sisters. It follows their story as well as like tyrannical local figure who is making these dodgy arms deals, or trying to make these dodgy arms deals, and abuses his wife in the most horrific and horrifying way. It's so terrible, though, those scenes, and so yeah, but how he handles that, I just felt like wasn't quite right, because it is so horrific that how he describes her reaction afterwards, and the conflict between them, I felt like it needed more space or time or a different way of handling that to fully show the consequences of that. And yeah, I just felt like slightly uncomfortable about how that was written, and also the story of his family I feel like wasn't fully fleshed out. So I wish in a way that the novel had just stuck with telling the story of this young soldier caught in this conflict, because the scenes where it shows him as he's sort of disorientated by the madness of the war around him are so powerful that yeah, the whole novel could have just been written from his point of view, but yeah, nonetheless, I found this quite like a powerful novel. Another novel about political and social conflicts and individuals caught up in that, which, you know, is a lot of novels. A lot of novels cover that. But yeah, another novel that I read is Isabel Allende's Petal of the Sea. And I've never read anything by Allende before. And yeah, I thought this novel is so well done and well crafted. I think it was first published a few years ago, and she's published many books over many years, and so slightly like in a different way from these other books, I feel like you can tell this is a really skilled writer that has honed her craft. And because I found this genuinely informative about conflicts of the Spanish Civil War and the Civil War in Chile, and but also really drew me into the lives of the characters that are caught up in it. And so there's a woman in Spain who falls in love with a soldier, and she's come from a very humble background, and like completely impoverished background, and she's been adopted by this family, and one of the sons of this family she falls in love with, and he's a soldier. She has a natural musical talent to her, and she becomes pregnant by this man who is lost in conflict, and after the Franco takes control of the country, she realizes she needs to leave, and so she leaves with the soldier's brother that she fell in love with, who was a trainee doctor, and they find that they're able to, so they go into exile for a while, and to completely escape, they find that they're able to travel to Chile in South America, because Pablo Neruda, the author, campaigned to allow refugees from the Spanish Civil War to come to Chile. And so yeah, it's like quite a complicated story, but it's really moving how she sweeps you along, drawing you into the characters' lives as they make these movements, and in order to be allowed into Chile, they have to marry each other. Basically her brother-in-law and her, and so at first it's just this kind of marriage of convenience, but over time they find they develop this real affection for each other, and so you follow that over the course of their entire lifetimes, basically, as they make these moves to Chile and get drawn into Chilean society, and yeah, how she follows their stories as well as a number of like other kind of peripheral characters' stories, I think is so well done, and I was just completely swept up into this novel, and I'm sort of charmed because it's snowing again out in the sunshine, but yeah, an incredibly moving novel. And finally, I read Ruth Ozeki's new novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, quite a long novel. And I have to admit, at first, I really wasn't sure about this book in the form that she gives it, because it's about a boy named Benny whose father has recently died and he's mourning him. And his mother, she's been working as at this job, which has basically she's become like her job has become outdated, and so she's being like phased out, and she doesn't have any too many like strong friends or family that she can rely on or fall back on, and Benny is experiencing a lot of mental health issues, and I feel like the way that addressing these issues to do with mental health and teenagers, and especially teenagers, that like teenage life is like so difficult for anyone, and so to describe the journey of someone that has just like lost their father, who he really loved, is makes the experience of teenage life like so much harder, and as a part of his mental health issues, he is feels like objects are speaking to him, like not with direct speech, but more like the emotions are sort of emanating from them, and he can really feel them and hear them. And I wasn't too sure about the construction of that device at first for describing this experience, because it seems slightly artificial to me, and that part of the book is actually narrated by a book itself, and there's this dialogue between the physical book and Benny, and they sort of have these conversations with each other, and I wasn't too sure about the construction at first, because like it almost seemed like she wasn't obeying her own rules, and that we were getting the text of and the speech of these objects, but then she emphasized how they weren't actually speaking that in like words, and so I found that slightly incongruous, and also I wasn't sure about in conveying the emotional lives as a device to convey the emotional lives of the characters, because she describes quite early on like a traumatic experience of sexual trauma in childhood that the mother experienced, but then almost describes it as like, oh, but this is something that the book wrote or created or constructed. And so I wasn't sure, like, well, is that real, or is that the most like sympathetic way of describing this experience that the mother went through, and sort of the handling of the mother in general I wasn't too sure about for quite a while, but I did like eventually like ease into the story, and did feel quite moved by it, and in how she portrays the real difficulty that both the mother and son are going through over a period of time, as well as a number of individuals that are connected with them that don't fit into mainstream society. And I did feel in a way that she was being slightly too sort of preaching or kind of about these like issues to do with consumerism and materialism, and I agree with a lot of what she was saying, but it almost felt like it was the author speaking rather than letting it be described through the interactions of the characters, and so I just wasn't totally sure about that, though overall, I did think the novel was quite moving and effective, but just the construction of it, I wasn't sure if it was just entirely necessary. Like I've been questioning sometimes, like these kind of metafictional devices, are they really necessary, or could the author just tell the life of the character in a more straightforward narrative, and would that be more effective in a way, or impactful? I kind of question that sometimes, and I don't know if the devices that Ruth Ozeki used in this novel were entirely necessary, though it's quite a creative way of telling the story and, telling it from a new angle. So yeah, I did enjoy this book, but yeah, I like question some of its devices. So those are all the books I read. I'd love to know if you've also read any of these books, and if you have any thoughts or feelings about them. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, please let me know in the comments below. But if you also want to tell me about some good or great or maybe even bad things that you read over the past month in March, I'd love to hear about that as well, and we can have a chat in the comments below. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things and staying warm if it's also cold where you are, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.